So welcome everybody. Thanks for having me speak today. Super excited to be here and also talk a little bit about some of the work I do. And as my mom mentioned before, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more to the application side of cybersecurity as well as sort of what I do on a day-to-day basis. So there's a bunch that we're going to hit on here. I have some slides that I'm going to work off of. They've got a bunch of resources, things like that, because I know that's something I always appreciate when people give me presentations. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of a live walkthrough of a bunch of different websites and things like that, just to give you an idea of what the resources and public information that's out there that you can leverage if you're interested in some of these. And with that, a little bit about myself. All right, starting from the bottom here. So I initially started my undergrad at Mississippi State, was at the Digital Forensics Training Center. It was a place I worked that helped teach law enforcement how not to mess up digital evidence. That was something that's really big, especially when you're trying to do cyber crimes. And before we had an entire set of professionals these days around us, so this is probably 10, 15 years ago, it was your local law enforcement officers that were going and, of course, trying to take a computer. And a lot of them, frankly, at the time, didn't even know what the different computer parts were. So we would take out a hard drive and show it to them and, that kind of thing so that people understood how to handle digital evidence. So I was a scholarship for service student, which that meant that National Science Foundation was paying for part of my undergrad, and in return, I had to work for the federal government in some capacity. And so I think it was around junior year, I went to a career fair, and somebody said, "You know what? You would be great for this one government organization that they need people that have digital forensics experience because they do a lot of prosecution against child porn cases," which I'm imagining a room full of shocked people there because, that was the career killer right there for me. So I decided to shift away from digital forensics work at that moment, and then went on to pursue my master's at the University of Tulsa, also in computer science, with a heavy emphasis on cybersecurity and cyber operations. So I saw on the CySER website that there's a lot of talk about the CAE cyber ops. That University of Tulsa is one of those. And so I went through and got to do a bunch of reverse engineering. And at the end of that, I actually ended up first at Sandia National Labs. What's sort of interesting about the national labs is they're very different in how they operate. A lot of this is rooted in where they came from. Sandia is the engineering laboratory. Some of the other labs make things go boom. And Sandia is the one that makes sure that it gets to the target. They said always never when it comes to nuclear weapons. You always need it to explode when you need it to, and you never want it to explode when you don't. And so I was part of a team there called the Information Design Assurance Red Team. So this is how I started progressing in my career. I did a little bit of software engineering. I then started looking at security testing, got into red teaming around that time. I was about at Sandia for 3.5 years. And then I started thinking about, doing some of these security tests is fun, but it gets boring because it's the same thing over and over again. And that's what part of the reason I like cybersecurity is the changing, that always learning aspect that was highlighted before. And so I looked at how can we automate some of this stuff, because this is a lot of these techniques, the things that we're testing against are things that people still need to test against at scale, but I don't want to do it every time. And so I started writing a proposal for a tool or framework that did that. And right around the time I was writing that proposal for some internal funding, MITRE released a tool called Caldera, which effectively did exactly what I was writing my proposal on. And so instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, I decided I would go work on it. So I applied to MITRE, I got in, and that's where I did a year, almost 2 years out in Washington, D.C. For those of you that don't know, Sandia is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then, so I was out there in DC for 2 years working on MITRE ATT&CK, which we'll go into a lot more detail here later. And then also I got to work on sort of that project Caldera. And that was sort of the intro I had to what I'll call is like threat-informed testing. And again, we'll go into more detail on some of that. But then that kind of continued to progress. I went back to Sandia for sort of a year, and then I decided to leave what is the government and the FFRDC's, federally funded research and development centers, and try out a startup. And so that's where I've been now for a year and a half as one called Scythe. And it essentially sort of takes, one of the challenges, and one of the reasons I moved away from the FFRDCs was that I'm super passionate about this technology and this idea of automating some of this. And so Caldera sort of was the first part of this, but when you're looking at sort of product maturity, FFRDCs aren't supposed to compete with industry. And so there's a ceiling to how much that you can do there with a certain set of technologies. And then it sort of gets moved over to industry. And the idea is that industry will take it and productize it and move it. And so that to me is sort of my step over to Scythe. So that's just something that I like to sort of at least give you a little bit of my career path, because I think a lot of you will go off in a bunch of different directions. I'm sure some will stay in sort of the academic system in academia. And then, of course, you have sort of the FFRDCs, Sandia, the national labs, all of those, MITRE. They have UARTs too, or something that are more DoD focused. But there's a bunch of different career paths here, of course, and then there's private industry. So that's just something I like to highlight, is that you can touch point on a bunch of these. And as I progress through my career, I've sort of gradually just chosen one more specific thing. And I've actually chosen, all right, this is not an area that I want to be an expert in. And so that's something I imagine that a lot of you will face the same in your careers, as you'll gradually decide more and more on what are some of the specifics you want to focus on. And that's something, the advantage of working at large organizations, whether it's a big company like a Microsoft or an Amazon or a place like Sandia, is that you can specialize, or in academia, being a professor, you can specialize in a specific problem or thing like that. But when you get to a small company like Scythe, when I joined, we had under 20 people. And now I get to put on a bunch of different hats. And so that's just something that I've thrived in the environment. It's something I've really enjoyed, but just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the differences in some of these fields. Now let's talk a little bit about my day-to-day before we go on to the next slide. Let's see. I don't know if I can actually pull up and see hands here, but how many people have heard of the new Microsoft Word 0 Day that came out 2 days ago? Not a whole lot of hands. That's okay. It's not your job to. And that's something that that just came out, and that's part of what sort of what my job entails around, is dealing with how do we take something like that and package it into, of course, something that our customers, or in general, people can understand and test against. Now, what you might not know about some of these things is that there's actually a market around 0 day vulnerabilities. And for those of you that aren't aware of that, it means that it's a vulnerability in something that has been discovered, and it's 0 days because it hadn't been discovered before. There's a company called Zerodium, or Zerodium, however you want to pronounce it, that is an exploit vendor. And so this is something that you can debate the ethics of it. And I think they're a French company that will pay out researchers for these types of vulnerabilities. And the idea is they only sell to certain nation states, but you can come and see, if you're a security researcher here, how much money these things you would get paid. And so it's something that I like to showcase, because people don't necessarily realize like how much money is in and behind some of these exploits. Zerodium may not have had this one. This is just an example. But for instance, we've got Word or Excel remote code execution here is $100,000. And so that's something that, that's a nice little paycheck if somebody were to discover that. Windows remote code execution with no clicks, so the user would never see anything, is $1 million. And then let's get down to mobile. Just to give you an idea, this is if you've got an Android phone, if somebody used a full chain compromise here, with 0 clicks, again, you'll see you've maybe read or heard about some of the vulnerabilities with iPhones and iMessage, where somebody would send an iMessage to a certain target, and they wouldn't even, nothing would show up and their phone would be compromised, like everything. So if you can do something like that for iOS, you can get 2 mil and 2.5 for Android. So these are good milestones for where some of the state of security is for some of this. The cheaper it is, the easier it probably is, or less customers want that kind of thing. So it's a very interesting sort of market to keep track of. And that's just something I do like to at least throw out some of these resources, because these are all public sources. And this is something that is critical, especially when we start talking about IT and OT sort of coexisting. Any questions? Am I hearing a mic jump? That's what I'm happy to take, pause every couple of minutes too for questions. I'm going to jump around to a bunch of different resources. So if you want to hold your question, you can, or ask me. I'm happy to engage. I'll just need somebody to like flag me or something.
Are there any questions?
Cool. We'll keep rolling. All right. So a lot of what I do is security testing. And so a lot of people ask, how do we get into security testing? You may have heard of pen testing, red teaming, that kind of thing. And so I've got a bunch of security training recommendations here if you're interested in it. It's a ton of different things to cover. I've got limited time here and I'm going to hit on a bunch of them. And most of these are specific to web applications. They're specific to enterprise systems. And so not quite as much on some of the operational technology and industrial control system space, although there are more and more resources coming out around it. There's like an embedded security CTF, if that's something that you all have done any CTFs in the space. It's sort of a way that people learn. Same with like Try Hack Me and Hack the Box, or essentially capture the flags, where you solve a small cybersecurity challenge. And the idea is that you can sort of progressively become more and more used to the types of challenges you might see day to day in cybersecurity. And so they demonstrate some of these vulnerabilities that maybe you've heard about or read about. So again, bunch of things here, free classes, some paid ones too, just a general set of recommendations I tend to provide people that I'm mentoring, things like that. All right. So let's get to adversary emulation, because this is a scoping down the type of security testing we're doing. Now, when you're doing security research, and this is what I started at when you're at Sandia and some of that, security research is looking at something like the power grid and saying, how could we attack this, right? How could we take this down? How could we impose something that's not supposed to happen, right? Instead of that accidental, we had more people turn online and our systems weren't quite ready to deal with that, but we were able to recover. How can you induce that effect, right? And maybe that's through manipulating certain protocols or sending packets or data that something wasn't expecting. And so this is an incredibly wide thing that you can do. I mean, anything's on the table. And so that's part of the challenge with it, though, is that for adversaries and for most people that are trying to defend these systems, you can't come and say everything's on the table. We can, spend this unlimited time, effort, and energy in it. That's just not how it works, not how budgets work. And so you have to figure out a way, how do we scope this down while still making sure we're hitting the key points? And so that's where we get into the adversary emulation portion. And it's taking that security testing that we're doing that has that super wide scope and narrowing it down to something of what are the capabilities that our adversaries have, what have they showed, and what can we make some logical assumptions or jumps into what they would be able to do in the future. And so that's what's really key here. And so that's why I call it data-driven red teaming. I've got a blog post on this again that goes into more depth if you like reading instead of listening in this case. But the idea behind this is we are scoping things down. Because realistically, this is something I always like to remind everybody about in cybersecurity about adversaries, is as adversaries have continued to evolve and they need to attack more and more infrastructure across the entire world, right? They have to scale. And to scale, they have to build tools. They have people, they have timelines, they have deadlines, they run agile. All of those things that you hear about that industry does, adversaries do the same thing. They run it as a business. And so that is how And that's the reason I bring that up is sometimes there will be this characterization that adversaries are this big ball of like mystery and they have all of this unlimited budget. And that's just frankly not true. So that's something that I just want to, demystify right now is that is why adversaries have to pick and choose their battles too. They have to choose what they're going to write, what code they're going to write, what they're going to arm sort of their operators with. And that's something that adversary emulation tries to essentially take that and measure it. Now, there's red teaming, again, is that broad scope, but how do we determine what adversaries actually do, right? It sounds great in theory. It's something that has been, that would be a logical conclusion, but we need that information. And so that's where cyber threat intelligence comes in. And this is where MITRE ATT&CK comes in. So I want to take you through a little bit about what MITRE ATT&CK looks like. So what is attack? It's a knowledge base of adversary tactics, techniques based on real world observations. So the thing that, to give you a little bit of history about attack. So about 10, 15 years ago, there was no categorization. There's no reports coming out about what adversaries are doing. There's still a lot of hacking going on. It just wasn't very public. And so there was sort of a turning point when there was something called Operation Aurora against Google. And they came out and said, we got hacked. And that was sort of a tipping point in the industry because a lot of people were basically, if they had been compromised, if they had been hacked, they were trying to hide it. But if Google can say it was hacked, well, we don't have the resources of Google, so we can say we got hacked and it'll be okay. And so that's what was sort of an initial turning point. And more we got to see things come into the public. Now, sort of in parallel to this, there's also a lot of the information was in government, right? It was in behind closed doors. It was had a lot of classification and security around it. But as more and more people saw the need to track these things for everyday business, they moved into the private sector. They started founding companies. Some of them you may have heard of: CrowdStrike, SentinelOne. Microsoft even has an entire group that is dedicated to this, and they have their own endpoint detection and response and cyber threat intelligence groups within their organization. And so it really took off in the private industry, and it actually took off so much the private industry was getting better data than the government, like just as a whole. They had better insight into all of the different companies and organizations that they were protecting because they were sending knowledge back. And that was the entire sort of premise behind CrowdStrike, was that you install essentially an antivirus, next gen antivirus, that's what they call it, endpoint detection and response tool on your endpoint. And then it would send all of this data up to the cloud. And then CrowdStrike would have all of their super bright intelligence analysts would comb through all of that data looking for adversaries. And as soon as they found an adversary in any of their customers, they would be able to write a detection to purge it out of all of them at the same time, regardless of what industry they were in or anything like that. And so that's where the whole CrowdStrike, crowdsource striking, of course, they made a business out of it, a very successful one. And that's just something that sort of gave industry a ton more data. Now, why does that matter? That matters because along in 2016, MITRE came up with a set of groups and techniques based on what they were seeing out in the wild. Once all of these private companies had all this data, they of course need marketing. They need reasons for people to come buy them. And so they started generating these reports. And they had these cyber threat intelligence reports that they would build out that would have a list of not only what some adversaries are doing, but of course, how they're detecting them. You should buy our product. And with this came a level of information that had previously not been public. And so as more and more companies came out, competition grew. And so they would expose more and more about how they were detecting and all of these success rates. And of course, what this meant is now we had this new catalog of information to work from. But like anything, most companies, they were pitching things in their own way. And so there's no way to cross-examine or check to see what companies are detecting what or what matters to me. And so this is where attack comes along. is it was designed to be a set of abstraction layers to communicate exactly what adversaries had seen. It was meant to be sort of a reference library and a framework that you could take any of those reports and map to so that it's a common language for everyone to talk about. Now, one of the advantages of attack is that everything in here is something that has been seen by real adversaries leveraging in a compromise. So again, that's how we narrow the scope, because security researchers can come up with all sorts of ingenious ways to bypass controls, all of those EDRs and antivirus that you see. But adversaries have that limited set because they have to do something at scale. And that's what attack categorizes here. So the idea is across the top, you have the broadest of categories. It's called the tactic, right? It's TTP, tactic, technique, and procedure. Tactics are the overall goal that the adversary is trying to achieve: reconnaissance, initial access, execution, persistence, all of these things that adversaries want to do. Then underneath them, we have techniques. This is the technical means by which the adversary achieves their tactic. And so we start moving down into increasing levels of detail. And then, of course, the most detailed is the procedure. And so just to give a quick example, I'll pick one here from Discovery is always a good one. And so it's a lot. If you've never seen this before, it can be a lot to take in at first, but you can click on any of these. It's got, a technique ID. This is going to be important later. It's got whether it has sub-techniques, which were another layer of abstraction that MITRE added, but it gives you sort of an overview. And then the key thing here is these procedure examples. So we have these groups, APT groups, Advanced Persistent Threat. It was a naming scheme coined by the company Mandiant, who just got purchased by Google a couple months back. And that's the idea behind it, is that this is a nation state threat actor. And so it has what they did. And then, of course, this also important citation, right? And that's what makes this super critical, is that it is such a data-backed resource. And so this is something that when we say adversary emulation, it's talking about leveraging and using some of these tools the same way adversaries do, because we've seen it happen, right? There's no guessing. That's something that's always a challenge in security research and in security testing, is the answer to the question, so what, right? Why do I care about you telling me this is vulnerable? What business impact does it have? And this is where I'll jump out for a minute and tell you that if there's some recommendations I could make for engineers and folks in the room, computer scientists, really anyone, is understanding business impact, regardless of what you're going into, whether it's academia, private industry, public space. That is going to serve you extremely well. You always are going to have to prove why what you say, what you do matters to the business. That's how it goes in the real world. And so that's how you're going to get money for grants and funds and things like that. And so being able to communicate why that matters is really important. And so in this case, attack has done a lot of this for us. We have these specific groups. We can say this has been exploited in the wild. You can even click on some of these groups and you can look at who they're targeting, right? Travel, hospitality, academic, and telecommunications industries. Now, this is in Iran and across Asia, Africa, Europe, that kind of thing. And so you can use that as a reason to say, hey, we fall under one of these. This group may target us. And so that's something that's super critical about attack, is it provides all this information. Now, one of the challenges with it is being able to leverage this information to actually build a test, because it relies on you or me or somebody else interpreting this to execute and understand exactly what this means, right? It's good for people that are experts in the space or people that are learning and trying to read through it, but it's really hard to sort of scale that out. So let's jump back really quick. This is how attack works. When they get one of those reports, they are going to come in and try and extract all of those different techniques out. And they do it by hand, have an analyst that walks through it and reads through it. So it's subject to potential human error, but the idea behind this is, it's still something that has to be done. And it isn't automated. which is part of the challenge here in scaling this out, is that if it takes 3 months for you to take a new report and put it into attack, that's 3 months that an adversary has to change what they're doing. So there's a bunch of challenges behind this. Now, one other thing I want to talk about with attack is that they have different matrices. So I've showed this one, and this is, we've got like Windows, Mac OS. And a few years ago, there's a new one that came out, ICS. And this is something that, again, is very critical because there have been more and more attacks on industrial control systems. Now, if you're familiar with some of the, that's, my mom talked about the blackout in, 2003. But if you follow what's happening in Ukraine and what has been happening in Ukraine, Ukraine's been through a couple of blackouts, and they were induced by a hacker group. And so this is where I'll jump over to one of my book recommendations. It's called Sandworm. And this is the group that targets the infrastructure and power grid within Ukraine and has successfully taken it down multiple times. And so they have deployed cyber weapons, things like that. So just to give you sort of an idea. Now, there's a lot that goes into sort of the research behind this. And so it's very, I encourage you again to listen to this. I'm almost done with it. And it's been something that sort of links a bunch of the events that I've had over the past, decade. But let's go back a little bit to talk about some of the first attacks on industrial control systems. Can anybody give me the name of what people call, we'll say, the first cyber weapon? I see a hand. Just shout it out.
Go ahead, shout it out.
Stuxnet, right?
Yes, Stuxnet, which goes to my second book recommendation, Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter. And so Stuxnet was the first major cyber weapon. And this was something that is suspected to have been part of a joint operation between the United States and Israel. And the idea behind Stuxnet was that it was going to help slow down the Iranian nuclear enrichment. And so what happened was that Stuxnet would take advantage. So Stuxnet, we talked about 0 days here and like Microsoft 0 days. I think Stuxnet, I can't remember whether it was leveraged 5 or 7 of them by itself. That's how you know it's super sophisticated, is because most of the time, really good researchers can find 1 or 2 at a time, but packaging everything like that into 7 or 5 even is a huge, it's a huge like amount of time, effort, energy. And so for those of you that might not be familiar with Stuxnet, first of all, it was tough because they had to get it into a network that wasn't connected to the internet. So they effectively had to create a worm and build something that looked for a very specific set of programs that were installed, things like that on the network before it would deploy its payload. And its payload did 2 different parts. And this is where it leveraged a HMI, right, human machine interface. And it would essentially show the operator that everything was happening normally. And while it was doing that, so anybody that checked in on it, it would spin the centrifuges fast enough to break them. And of course, if you are the major operator that's trying to understand why your centrifuges are breaking, you're looking and it's telling you that everything's fine. And so to do that, Stuxnet had to leverage not only fooling the Windows user and the person that was looking at it, but it also had to be able to speak or leverage technologies that spoke to those centrifuges to exploit it. And that's where we start coming to the challenges in the IT, OT space, is that you have that bridge, because there was a Windows system that was an HMI. That's where they leveraged some of the 0 days. And then they're able to fool the operators for a number of years. And it is thought that there was some setback in the program. But it was also sort of a point at which once this was exposed, it was sort of, there's no going back. This is, the idea of this type of weapon is something that lots of other countries and places have developed and unleashed since. And that's what Sandworm talks about, some of those and sort of the widespread destruction of some of them. Give you an idea of another one that's more recent. It's called NotPetya. It was a worm that leveraged a 0 day in, what was it? I think it was in SMB, which is on every single Windows machine. And it could laterally move. It could do all those things. That's a big thing about worms. For anybody that's ever thought about building one, the idea behind them is that they will always escape beyond what you intended them to do. And this one was, again, targeted at Ukraine and escaped outside of it. And it hit the global shipping giant Maersk. And they had a major issue that all of their domains got encrypted, similar to what you've seen with ransomware over the past couple of years. And so that's the sort of impact that things can have today. That's that interconnectedness. We've talked about about the grid, but it's all systems now because everyone expects that things happen instantly. There's all of these, we talk about the global supply chain and how that slows things down, right? Having a ship that's stuck in, was it the Suez Canal, right? That, put things months behind schedule. And that's where, they estimated that it would take years for everything to get fully back on track across the entire world. And so everything's so interconnected that having a large shipping company like that's most of their computer systems are down for potentially days or weeks, is something that is just, there's so much money. I mean, the lowball estimate, I think, for NotPetya globally was $10 billion in damages. That's the floor. And so this is just to give you an idea of when you do combine what has typically been sort of the cyberspace, now we're connecting it with additional context with some of these other critical infrastructure systems. This is why it's so important to test against what adversaries are doing, is so that you can be prepared and resilient against that kind of stuff. Now, I mentioned that we have all of these different MITRE ATT&CK for ICS ones. And so you'll notice here that a bunch of these, one of the challenges is when we're talking about ICS, like what devices are we talking about, right? Are we talking about the ones that control dams? Are we talking about the ones that control the grid? There's so many different devices. It's not the same as IT, where for the most part, you're going to hit 99% of people if if you're talking about Windows or Mac, right? There's not that same level of market penetration by one or two vendors in industrial control systems. And then especially when you start moving to different applications of those control systems. And so that's what makes some of these things difficult, because not all of these are going to work across each device. And so that's, again, I suggest you all, check out some of this stuff. It's very interesting. You can come and see the types of attacks that have been public. And so in this case, most of them are, let's see, Stuxnet's the big one. After that, we had what was called Indestroyer, Crash Override, which came out. Seen Triton or Trisis. So things get multiple names because they have multiple vendors that decide to name them. And of course, all of the different attacks on Ukraine. And that's basically been sort of the hotbed for attacks against industrial control systems in the wild, is what's suspected as, like I said, that group of Sandworm. And so this is where there's this ton of information out there. And that's something that I always like to talk to, is that there's so much information. Trying to pick through stuff is tough at times, but knowing that these resources are there for you to use and read and learn about, if you're interested in some of this, is going to be critical. So if you didn't know about what attacks could be used on ICS, you can click through it and see. There's a bunch of different views. Now, the cool thing too is all this is in JSON, right? If you're doing some analysis, that kind of thing, you can pull this stuff apart. You can automate it. There's a lot of different integrations. If you're using like Visual Studio Code, there's an entire thing where you can pull and dissect attack techniques in that if you don't want to use the website. Any questions about attack? Stunned silence. I'll take it.
So So obviously, people in Iran have figured out what we did or whoever did it with Stuxnet. So what do they do now if we win? And are we, or the entity that was doing this, are they trying to find other ways to slow them down?
So that gets into more, I'd say, the mission part of the discussion than some of the, I would say, just to make sure, just to reiterate the question, and my understanding of it was that, the group in Iran found out about Stuxnet, and then they obviously got rid of it. So what is being done, to potentially slow them down? And that's something that I don't have any insight into any of that kind of stuff. That gets more into it. It was part of it was tying a technology in a space that hadn't been used for potentially like geopolitical reasons, or at least not publicly. And that was sort of where Stuxnet crossed that boundary. It had a geopolitical reason for being there beyond espionage, or, well, I guess it was espionage, but beyond doing information and intelligence gathering, right? It was actively destroying something. And so it had an effect beyond sort of intelligence gathering. And that was sort of a barrier that, again, not publicly at least, had been crossed. And so I think from that standpoint, that's more of what I see as sort of the main focus of around Stuxnet, at least that I can talk about and have information on. As far as like new things that are coming out, I have what you have, what's in the open source and information sharing. And so as things get released, though, this is where I'll check. I look for things like this. There's also, I think I've got here in another, a bunch of good threat reports. So these are things that get released every year. One of them is by Dragos, and they're more ICS specific. They're a company that does ICS security, and they release a sort of year in review. And that's going to have some of those different adversaries that there are out there. Now, one thing that I'll mention around all of this is attribution is hard. It may seem easy, and it might say, all right, it's targeting this country, but it's one thing for you or I or anybody to come out and say, hey, I'm guessing that this is, this country targeting this country. But the challenge with that in the cyberspace is that there's a lot of different things that you can do that make it more difficult, that adversaries do, to try and make attribution difficult. Because if something can't be attributed back to you, then someone might make a wrong mistake, right? And they might choose, this is the whole argument against hacking back, where private companies could hack back against who they think hacked them. And it might sound good, but the attribution capabilities of most companies and of a lot of companies is not very good. Even these threat intelligence companies most of the time say, a level of confidence that they have about their intelligence, but in some specific cases, you will see the US government will come out and say, this is who did it. But that's only been recently that's happened. That's only over the last few years that's happened. So attribution is very difficult. And that's what's made conversations around these especially difficult, is you, for a while, have countries that will just flat out say, nope, wasn't us. And so you either have to prove your intelligence, which might reveal your sources, or they may decide that it doesn't matter. As far as they're concerned, what are you going to do about it? And that's been the whole issue with cyberspace as a whole, is where are the red lines? What are something that if critical infrastructure is attacked, what sort of response does that trigger? And that's the whole thing with the questions with some of the blackouts in Ukraine and some of that, is at what point does cybersecurity and some of these things need a kinetic response, right? Because that's escalatory. And those are all of the decisions that make cybersecurity a complex field, especially when you're navigating it in geopolitics. So long answer to your question. Hopefully I at least got something in there that you resonated with.
That's very interesting. I'm also interested in how large these kind of red companies are, and what's their criteria for being an employee. You have to have a certain level of unethicalness, about you or something. And if somebody's untrustworthy, can you trust them to really support your company? I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting dilemma. I can see if it's a nation state, why they might have a motivation to do it. But if somebody's not a nation state and they're, maybe doing ransomware or something, the kind of person they hire might go against them. Anyway, what do you have to say about that?
So just to make sure I'm understanding the question is who gets hired at some of these threat groups and things like that. And you had some questions around the attributes of the people that are being hired there, and maybe they would turn on you, things like that. Just to make sure, is that the question restated? Okay. So a couple of things. You have to remember that a lot of these groups, who they're targeting is very much dependent on their point of view. While ransomware groups hitting us is in the US, and Europe, and some of that to us is very damaging. It's threatening. It's awful. To some of those ransomware groups, they're not concerned. Like from their point of view, they are potentially taking things that they feel are owed. Especially when we talk about a lot of the ransomware groups have been attributed to also be potentially state sponsored by Russia. So there's very much part of what they do. A lot of the ransomware is it checks the first thing it does when it gets on a system, checks the keyboard to see if there's a Russian keyboard installed and whether it's the primary keyboard. Then it won't encrypt it if it does. And so the idea is they're not targeting their own. And so from that standpoint, they don't necessarily see that they're in the wrong. They don't see it because it is their perspective and point of view that they are targeting essentially what is an adversary. I mean, we don't really hear, but if there was we'll say a US ransom group, right, that's targeting Russia, I mean, are you gonna, and you and I gonna get up here and say, actually, you shouldn't be doing that? I mean, maybe we will, but that's where it's potentially going to be a little bit more of it's a different conversation. Now, I will say that around when we talk about ransomware and things like that, economics have started to change because of ransomware. Previously, cyber crime groups were people that made money off of scams. They were annoying, but they weren't well financed, well funded. Ransomware flipped that on its head. And part of that, to give you an example, the Conti ransomware group, CONTI, they made $2 billion last year with a B. That's a lot of money. And so one of the challenges with that is now they have a lot of resources to hire new people to buy some of those 0 days. And one of the challenges, of course, is that if they buy a 0 day, they can weaponize it at scale very quickly. And that's something that's very challenging, is trying to deal with the capability of those ransomware groups. And we've seen more and more nation states get involved to start to tackle that, because previously it was sort of small businesses and people having to deal with it themselves. And now that it's potentially disrupted more and more, and as there's been more links to nation state groups, you've seen that these big takedowns that happen that are joint international takedowns. It's infrastructure. It's potentially, initially compromising those things. And that's where you get into things that law enforcement can do that we as regular citizens cannot. And so there's a bunch of different things around it that, again, gets into the geopolitics of what makes cyber so challenging. And like, for instance, some members of the Sandworm group were indicted by the Department of Justice. Now, are we going to get them extradited out of Russia? Probably not. But there is stuff that is coming out there. They are trying to put at least more pressure on people that are taking more, we'll say, aggressive cyber campaigns. But it also begs the question that, turnabout will be seen as fair play. And so there's a chance that, US operators or other operators could be exposed as part of it. And is that something that, how much more difficult does that make recruiting at specific agencies if all of a sudden your identity gets outed? So there's a lot of different conversations around there. I would say at the core, yes, some people could turn on some of those groups, but for the most part, when it comes to cybercrime, it's as long as you pay people, that tends to keep them happy. But if not, then, we can show you what happens. Because the Conti group forgot to pay somebody on time. And so in retaliation, their manual got leaked. And so this was translated from Russian, but this shows a step-by-step of everything they execute in the tool. And so this is a great insight into the level of information that all of these people get when they're doing their operations. In addition, someone else continued to not get paid, so they leaked group chats. What were the chats about? They were about birthdays, right? They were about people emailing each other that somebody started 3 months after them and is making more pay than them, and that's not fair. Like, they're a normal company and have all of the things with that, and they have limited expertise that's writing these things. I use this case when I'm giving trainings and talking about, like, do you know how many pen tests, red teams, that kind of thing have documentation that's this good? I can tell you 0. Nobody does. But that's part of the reason that groups like this have been so effective, is that they can scale out their operations and their expertise because they have something that's so detailed. The only expertise anyone needs is the ability to copy paste. That's it. You copy and paste all of these in, and it will work. And it will work on, spreading throughout the network. It'll work on trying to ransom different groups. And so there's a bunch of different things in here, and I'll post this in the Zoom chat because I don't think I had this one in my, but these are the types of information that you can look at to at least get an idea of what adversaries are doing. And so it's really easy to do adversary emulation here because you have literally the playbook that they use. Now let's talk about adversary emulation when it comes to OT and ICS. Historically, there's been a lot of challenges because the traditional tools that you would use might actually cause issues because legacy systems that are industrial control systems can be fragile. They don't deal with uncertainty. They don't really have as much air catching as they should. And so there's an instance where you can run an Nmap scan, which stands for network map. And it's a tool commonly used by pen testers and system admins now to map out a network. And running that, and if it was able to contact a certain type of controller, it would cause a reboot or a shutdown, which is obviously a problem. And so what's happened historically is that people have treated, and organizations have treated those as sort of fragile systems. But the issue is those fragile systems are now under attack. Part of the reason that they are is because a lot of these old systems weren't meant to be connected to the internet. However, when you are the person managing 4 dams or 5 dams in the middle of the country, and they're all 4 hours in opposite directions, are you going to go and get in your truck and drive every time there's a problem? Or are you going to plug an Ethernet cable into that so you can do all of it from your home base? Guarantee you, most of you, including me, are probably going to do that second one. But the issue is because there hasn't been a good overlap in sort of those owners, operators, asset owners, and cybersecurity people, there hasn't been a lot of conversation between them that needs to happen to understand the risks associated with it, and also to make sure that people are able to secure those lines of communication. You all ever heard of Shodan? Maybe a few. So you can search the internet for everything. This will search. And so one way is a lot of times this industrial control system equipment works off of certain ports. And so you can scan the internet, no joke, for something with that certain port. And you can look for something that has, port 4555. And most of the time you can find, we could go search and say, I want to find this specific device, whether it's Siemens, SCL, those types of things. And in the developer manual, it'll say this communicates over port, 5447 or something like that. And so you can search the entire web for anything that has that open. And because companies try and keep those things unique, it means you're likely going to find a bunch of those different devices. And that was just an example I gave. I don't know if 5447 has anything, but there's a lot of these tools that adversaries use also to search the internet for vulnerable devices. And so whenever they develop a payload or have research or things like that, this is something that they're going to use to try and figure out where are some targets that I can go after. And so that's the challenge when it comes to OT and ICS is there's not enough combined expertise. Now, some of the labs, there's more and more companies that are trying to address some of this, but this is where also the challenge is because of the amount of research that is required to do anything in the space. Research is money, and it's a lot of money. Most companies do not spend, a significant portion of their budget on research because they need to keep operations going, and they've got a lot of other things, and they spend, some percentage that's probably less than 10 or 20% at the absolute max. And so you have to figure out, if in this case, in the ICS and OT world, if you're going to make that your business, you are going to have to potentially do a lot of research, or you do something passive. That is something that can be widely used. And then this gets to sort of our next set of topics. So I've got a bunch of extra MITRE ATT&CK resources, free training here. Cybrary has a MITRE ATT&CK Defender series if you want to do that, and some blogs. And then one thing I want to highlight is this tool called TRAM. Now, this was released by MITRE as their Center for Threat Informed Defense, and it's called Threat Report Attack Mapping. And this is where we're starting to see some elements of automation in that very manual process of taking reports. And so the idea behind this is that it can parse a report, use some machine learning to essentially walk through and try and identify MITRE ATT&CK techniques. And it would pop those up. The analyst can click confirm or not. So it still requires some human interaction, but it doesn't require someone reading the entire report. They only have to look at some of the what has already been picked out. And of course, by confirming or denying those things, you're also helping train it to get better in the future. So it's a cool thing. And that's something I just like to highlight some of those extra projects. So if you're interested in playing around with them, highly recommend it. Now, here are some companies that do things with industrial control systems or OT and adversary emulation. Anyone that does manufacturing, right? Anyone, Frito, Lay, all those that, make potato chips, all that stuff, they have equipment that requires making sure it's secure. Anyone that owns or operates critical infrastructure. I talked about dams. We've talked about power grids, those types of things. Anyone that creates products for any of those companies. SCL is a close one. So that's what I like to at least highlight that. Of course, DHS has CySER is critical infrastructure. And that's something that they've increasingly been more and more vocal in working with the community of information security professionals to try and get more information out around this. All the national labs, I think you all are probably pretty familiar with these. And then a couple of companies, including mine. But the other thing that I'll say that you might not think of is look for venture capitalists and their portfolios. If you're looking for jobs, if you're looking for companies in the space, they fund the companies and they're very proud of who they've funded. Like always, that is how VCs work, is they are trying to advocate for their companies to do the best. So Energy Impact Partners is a big one in this space. There are a couple like Duke Energy and some of that also have venture arms, Saudi Aramco, a bunch of those. And so they're big investors in trying to keep things going and secure. And so that's what they're funding the next sort of set of companies. Plus, if you're looking at starting your own, that's going to be something that allows you to have more insights into what is already funded and where's a niche you can maybe fill. All right, a couple of extra. Now let's talk about purple teaming just a little bit here. And purple teaming is essentially taking adversary emulation and security testing, and it's sort of putting it in a clear box so everyone can see what's happening. The idea behind this is that it's transparent and everybody can see what's happening. Now, I'll also highlight Ian Anderson from OG&E, this is Oklahoma Gas and Electric, that gave a talk on adversary emulation in OT environments. It's very good. It's about 25, 30 minutes and talks about it, sort of links some of the Purdue model and some of those other things that a lot of people in the space use. And then there's, again, a bunch of other resources. Now let's talk about attack evaluations. We've talked about adversary emulation and it sounds good. You're like, great. But what if somebody's already done a bunch of that for you, right? And that's what the attack evaluations are. Can you imagine getting all of the top companies together and getting them to essentially do a big bake-off of all of their products against each other? That is what the attack evaluations are. Now let's shift the focus a little bit. So some of you that might be thinking of either going into like designing experiments and stuff like that, sort of the scientific approach to this, is can you imagine building a test that every single one of those companies that are worth billions of dollars and all have big legal teams, big marketing teams, and the potential to sue you, frankly, can you design a fair test that everyone would be okay with? And that's the challenge, right? Is how do you build something that is realistic enough that everyone will buy into it, that the results are something that are not going to cause companies to want to sue you, but still get all of that buy-in. And that's the really careful balance that the attack evaluations has built. And so this is all the companies that do this. And there's a lot of public companies on here, some private ones, probably some you've heard of or seen before. But let's talk, like, this is for enterprise grade. And so I'll walk through a little bit of both, but check out this. There's one that was done for OT and ICS. There are 5 different companies. This is enterprise IT. This is OT, ITS. That should tell the story by itself, right? On how much money there is in the area. And that's one of the challenges, is getting that capital to even do those things. The other thing that's really interesting, has anybody here had CrowdStrike or any of these on their systems before? Malwarebytes, that kind of thing, right? What happens if you download a piece of malware? Come on, I'll get a little bit of audience interaction for this one. What happens when you download a piece of malware that's known? Yeah, blocks it, stops it, warns you, tells you, don't do that. That was bad. And it removes it for you. So all of these things tend to get installed on everything that they're testing, right? And then they're gonna stop. What do you think happens when you download something malicious from one of these vendors? Any guesses?
An email goes out to the rest of the company to inform them.
Yeah, that's about right. An email goes out. There's no active part of most of these. In fact, for the tests, what's really interesting is that all of these vendors have to be tested independently. They all have to set up their system in the network and then run the test. And so it requires basically a single week for each of these vendors to be tested. All 5 of these vendors could be tested in parallel because they're all working off passive network traffic that is collected. And that's exactly right. They send an email or something, because one of the challenges, as I think my mom did a great job of ending and talking about, is uptime for the grid is super important, right? If the difference, between people having power and not is leaving a piece of malware on a system, that piece of malware will get left in when we're talking about the ICS space. And so that's where things are different, is because the impact is greater. I mean, you can make arguments for business losses and things like that, but as we've seen with ransomware, some of those things can be quantified now pretty easily. But when it comes to these critical systems, you can't just shut them off. You can't always just patch them. And so a lot of investigation will be done into what was there, why is it there? And now we're getting more into since we've seen some of these attacks on electric grids, on what are some more active responses that we can do. But let me also tell you about another challenge in this space. There's a lot of them. And that's really the overarching challenge with ICS and OT is how much context is required to do security in it. So just to give you, another Stuxnet type example, but most of the things since then have still relied on something very similar. They're not as complex as Stuxnet, but they haven't needed to be. They essentially have a IT element, which spreads like normal malware through a network. And then they find somewhere that can talk to your devices. And they can do that through specialized network scanning and stuff like that. And then they'll deploy a different payload to target those industrial control systems. An example might be, to keep going with my dam example, that need to release more water, right? Something like that. Or in the case of if you are doing like foundries or building things, right? That the temperature can increase or decrease by a certain amount. Those things are typically legitimate commands, right? Because sometimes you do need to release more water. And the challenge is, how do you determine the intent behind the message? And that is really what sums up the challenge in everything. Is we have hit a point where a lot of what's happening, a lot of what red teams are testing and adversaries are using is things that are on the systems, that are how the systems are meant to be used. I talk about exploits. I like to divide things into two categories. Exploits, those ones I showed you with zero DM, that essentially take over something to gain access, to do code execution, to subvert it in a way that what it's not meant to do. The more challenging one is abuse cases, because this is taking a legitimate tool, a legitimate functionality, and using it for malicious reasons. And that is much, much harder to try and build a tool or a product around, because intent is something that is very hard to discern. And that's what a lot of these companies are trying to do with some machine learning, that kind of thing, to try and figure out what is the normal, and then identifying anomalies. But again, it's not a perfect science, and it's something that requires a lot of challenge. Now, what do the attack evals look like? It's a bunch of free data. And so this is where I like to show everyone, you can go in and see everything about it. I mentioned before the challenge of building something that every vendor would be okay with. You can click on any of these vendors and see the results of the different tests that they've done over the years. So you can click on any one of them. You can see the different scenarios, and you can see every single step. It has the detection type, which is the metric, and I'll get to that in a minute. And it has a note. Now, the note's important for two reasons. One, you as the person deciphering this, but it's also to make sure that everyone plays fair, and that MITRE isn't giving one vendor more a better metric than it gave a different one. This is a consistency. And so that's where they have screenshots for every single step that they do. And this is really important so the vendors can check each other to make sure that no one got a different metric than they were supposed to. And there's sort of a scale of metrics here and we'll go into that. And so you can compare individual results. You can also, so we can go and look at the specific evaluations, and you can see how it's changed over time, the different adversaries that they've chosen. But let's click on overview. Now you see all of the results you can click into. You have this operational flow. And this is, again, something that's, how do you design this test such that it is real, that the vendors aren't going to be able to game it easily, and while it still provides valuable information. And that's what they've done here, is they provided transparency into everything they did. They provide the exact MITRE attack techniques that they run. They provide the exact commands that they execute. Here's the environment that they set up for everyone. And the vendors also are only allowed to detect things. They're not allowed to block them. And the idea is that this is not a test on whether or not vendors can block certain techniques. It's about whether they can detect it, whether they have that analysis that they go through. Now, detection categories. This is small, but this is one of the hardest parts of building tests, is building the metrics that you're going to have. And so that's something that is really challenging. And again, just speaking from experience here, this is an underappreciated part of having to build out tests. Metrics are super critical because metrics are going to matter regardless of whether you're evaluating 25 different vendors, 5, or if you're trying to pitch your idea to a senior leadership team at your organization or your university. You need to make sure that you can explain in a simple way why something was categorized as such, and if there's a sort of a sliding scale of what is better than the other. Now, that's where some of the challenges and how people have used this data after the fact is in how the metrics have been communicated. They call them all detections, anything from having just the data and performing no analysis on it, that's telemetry, all the way through alerts and things like that. That's sort of the tactic and technique here. And so these are challenges. They have modifiers, delayed, config change, stuff like that. And all of these are important when you're trying to decipher the results. I'll say this is an underappreciated project. I've leveraged it. I actually wrote a paper with my wife and some other folks at Sandia. And that just got, I think, or is about to get published in IEEE Privacy and Security. But that's where it has all of that data that you can leverage in JSON. And so it is a bunch of real world data of a realistic test that is used. Now, let me show you a couple of things about it. I've already talked about some of the positives. We have the vendor configurations and setups. So the vendors also have to be transparent in what they're leveraging in the test. Transparency, you have comparisons that you can do, and they're continuing to move and do more. Now, there's no noise in the environment. There's no users. There's no people from all the different departments exchanging emails, doing that kind of thing. And so that's something that makes it not as realistic. Again, how would you inject that into the environment while making it realistic? It's a tough question. And then it takes a year between results. Now, what do you think? I mentioned before, how can you get everybody to agree to this? And this is because they're able to essentially take all of this and make it a massive marketing effort. And this is sort of the double-edged sword side of doing the tests and working with people and getting them to agree to it, is they need to be able to market the results. And so there's a lot of pushback around these because, they talk about 100% prevention and attack detection. And we all know ransomware is still a problem. So what does that mean in that case? It's still a really good data set, but there's definitely room for improvement. Now, I've talked a little bit about the attack evals walkthroughs. They do have the ICS attack evals, and this is where they have Triton is the one that they've done. And like I mentioned, they could evaluate all of these together. And there's a ton of different information that you can check out here. And it's scoped, right, a little bit differently because the focus of all these vendors is on making sure they can try and detect these specific devices. And so this is sort of a way to see how the industry is doing, right? And that's something that I always mention. Same detection categories, and then you can go and learn a little bit more. But this was done by a separate team that, of course, has some more expertise in industrial control systems. All right, I'm going to jump through a couple of these. We're going to talk a little bit about purple teaming really quickly. Why purple teaming matters, right? That transparency that we saw with the attack evals, that's what I do on a day-to-day basis, is do in condensed versions of that. And that's what we've been talking about with purple teaming. Now, purple teaming, just to, again, tie back to a career path, didn't exist when I started going through, when I started coming up in cybersecurity. No one mentioned it. There was no word about it. And so this is something that has, just in case as you go through your career and you're not quite syncing with anything that comes up, there might be new concepts that are coming out, and you get to maybe help push. And that's, again, part of the reason I am where I am, is to help with that. But in this case, we were essentially hired to do that same thing, except we had to also rate detections and things like that to help plug any holes that we found. And so we remained data-driven, picked a bunch of different threats that were different, Chinese, Russian, Iranian threat actors, because they tend to operate a little bit differently. And that's to make sure that we aren't going to be biased towards what the detections we're writing. We want to make sure that we stay data-driven. And so this was the first week. 94% of things were undetected. This is again why metrics are so important, and you need to be able to record everything you're doing. And then after 6 weeks, 64% detection rate. And a lot of this is working with something called Sysmon, which provides you more data. You can't do analysis, you can't do detections if you don't have data to work with. And that's one of the hard lessons of security is if you don't have the data, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot. So that was kind of cool. We gave a presentation on it. And then, of course, the vendor actually that we wrote the detections for released a blog around it so all their customers could benefit. Talked a little bit about like how that Google hack changed things. That's where the blue team part came in. Blue teams and red teams have been adversarial. They've really been, it's been a us versus them sort of mindset for a long time. And cyber threat intelligence becoming more public allowed red teams to scope more things to actual data so that it became less adversarial, but you still had some of those like foundations of not cooperating together. And that's what purple teaming is, collaborating. And so the idea behind it is you can train people by giving them real data to test on that isn't necessarily an actual adversary in your network, which is good. You can talk about the processes between teams. Most of the times in incident response, if somebody gets hacked, there is some sort of escalation, right, between teams to understand how do we remediate this? What is that business impact? Who's going to go brief the CEO while we clean this up? And so that's the kind of thing that's super important is you want to foster that collaborative mentality that has been missing in this space. Assume breach testing is another thing that's, assuming somebody got in, instead of trying to block everything like I talked about with that, the attack evals is assuming something got in. And there's an entire framework around this. I do want to leave some more time for questions. So I'll make sure my slides are posted. I think this is recorded too. So happy to talk to more of it afterward. And then the last slide I do want to jump to though is just a quick thing on learn something about AI ML, which I think sets up the next talk a little bit. I would just highly suggest this because as I've done more and more work across different parts, this is being sort of the next type of scripting, right? Scripting to automate things is something that you see increasingly about tasks that you're trying to scale. And AI is not going to necessarily solve everything, or maybe it is, let me know after the next talk. And, but the idea I think is that this is something that having a fundamental understanding of how it works and how to talk about it is something that's going to be critical. So here's a bunch of different resources around it. With that, I'll open up for questions.
I'll pick one.
You good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, team. This is Asaf. You don't see me properly. That was an awesome set of presentations, both by Mom and yourself. Lots of great resources, and I think you were set up for what the purpose of this one was. There was a career path, there was resources, and you were warned this is recorded, and it's going to be an extremely helpful resource for the rest of us. You have also set the stage well for me for talking about machine learning, and James and I will be doing that. And I want to thank you all again for also bringing up the power, and you told cybersecurity is at the heart of it. And so this was a perfect fit for what this workshop was meant to be. There was lots of sampler topics we've covered, and you are not expected to be good at all of them, but the fact that there is resources available will be useful for you. We will be resuming in 15 minutes. We'll take a break. And I'll come, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions before team leaves, or if you have to, and maybe while you think of a question, I also want to kind of bring up again. I don't think there was many occasions where I have 3 generations of people on one stage. So we are delighted to have you brought here and 3 generations of experts on their different topics. And so it was very exciting. And so thank you for making this happen. So let me see if you have questions for team. There were many things.
I have 2 sort of related questions.
Sure, go ahead.
One is, I've been told that it's very important to try to specialize in this field. So is there any area or job that you have felt that there's a big need for? That's the one. And then the other one is there a cross-discipline as well that you wish, like I wish this cybersecurity specialist had this set of skills as well in a whole other field?
So I missed the first question, but let me answer the second one first, and then we can work on the first one. So as far as cross discipline, yes, that is basically that is what people want. Now, where to build that? That's one of the challenges. Universities and courses and discussions like this are one avenue of it. I think the national labs, one of their advantages is that they employ so many types of experts. I mean, when I was at Sandia, if I needed a chemical engineering expert, we didn't have to go contract it out. I didn't have to go ask someone. I went and found a chemical engineer in the chemical engineering, division, and we could hash it out. And most of the time you would have a set of people that had that expertise, whether it was in power or grids or in chemical engineering, those types of things, that would sort of start to become the liaisons between the groups. And so they essentially got trained up from one side or the other. And that's something that we've seen. Having that co-location of experts at the labs has allowed some of that to be fostered internally. But of course, the problem is, like a lot of things I've said, is that doesn't scale, right? And the challenge is having both those experts in the same room. Also, historically, I'll rib my cybersecurity colleagues a little bit, have not always been open to discussions around context, business context, or context of things like the grid, right? There, we have historically given recommendations like, well, you need to shut it off. Like, I don't care, like what result it has, it's got malware on it and that's bad. And that's something that is shifting as we're seeing technology become adapted in literally everything. You have to have more business context around the technologies involved, what are the impacts if you do have to try and patch or push things out. And so I think some of that is shifting, and we're seeing more conversations where cybersecurity experts are being expected now to tailor their recommendations. And part of that is, of course, having more discussions around it. There have been some efforts. There's one called the ICS Village. And so that's a nonprofit that's trying to raise more awareness around some of these issues. But there's a lot of work to be done in that area, because yes, people want those cross-functional people and teams to happen or exist. But it's one of those things that it's hard to get people trained up fast enough, because it takes like 2 to 3 years, maybe at a minimum in like each of those spaces to get some level of knowledge to provide some level of confidence in their recommendations. So what was the first question? Somebody, go ahead.
Biggest need for jobs that you're seeing, like, what is it in cyber operations? Is it in threat intelligence? Is there one or two that you're seeing a big need for?
So threat intelligence is a huge one right now. I mean, that's big. We're seeing, actually, kind of cool to see more and more purple team specific job applications. One of the red teams and hacking and pen testing, all of that sounds really fun, and it is to some point. But the challenge is that those recommendations that happen afterward have been lacking for a long time, like a decade long time. And so people see the transparency of having a purple team, your turnaround time from when we test to when we make changes on our system and are able to leverage those and make ourselves better, tends to be in the hours to days instead of months to quarters time frame. And so that's why we're seeing more and more focus around the transparency. It also helps facilitate some of those questions around some of the conversations around that second question you asked, is that if I say, here's what I might do as an attacker, right, as a security researcher, if I have a grid expert in the room, they can say what that impact would be, right? If we get access to this system, what are the things that I can do to the grid from that? That's the context that having those interdisciplinary teams and having those people in a room. And I think purple teaming is driving that. So it is a little bit of a buzzword, I'm not going to lie, but it's one of those things where the collaboration aspect of it makes it makes it something that we've seen more and more companies trying to embrace to address some of those gaps. But it involves cyber threat intel, a little bit of reading of what adversaries do, which is cyber threat intel. So that's been a huge growing field. And I think that's been more and more what we're seeing is how do we turn this information over and how do we automate it? That's the other thing. Right now, experts in this field are also like the experienced experts. It's not fair. I'll just put that out there. The experienced experts are in high demand. There's also a lot of people that are trying to get in the space. And so there's a challenge with training people up. Everyone wants somebody that they can plug and play and, the person starts working immediately. And that's not how you build a pipeline. Right? That's not how you build up people and build sustainability. And so you have a bunch of companies competing over the same, 5 or more people. So I think that's something that's a bunch of challenges around how to build that up. But threat intel. All right. I do have a great resource on threat intel. So that was another good question. Let me grab that resource. So first of all, a former colleague of mine, her name's Katie Nichols. She's the director of threat intelligence at Red Canary. And she released a cyber intelligence self-study that has a bunch of free stuff. I just dumped the links in the Zoom. So if somebody there can pass them out, or I don't know if you all are on this, but I'd highly recommend one, following her. She gives great talks too. And so Red Canary is a fantastic company, gives really good reports. That was one of the ones I recommended. And then of course, following, she has that self-study that goes into how to think about intelligence analysis and things like that.
Any other questions? Oh, just on that note, what we're doing in CySER is in part to address that. The kind of training that you would get traditionally doesn't make you the kind of person what the industry or everything else is looking for now. And so what we're doing right now with this workshop at least addresses it and also what the CySER program does. If you do not have any questions, I think this would be a great place to take a break. Thank you very much again. If you are able to stay around, that would be a big one. Since we are all here, so we can afford to be a little flexible, so we'll take 15 minutes break, and then we'll resume whatever 15 minutes later is. And to right, so.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim. See you later.